The West must abandon its neo-colonial habits when it comes to Africa. That was a message from Russia's UN ambassador to his Security Council colleagues after they criticized Mali for strengthening its cooperation with Moscow.
Once again, we listened to the negative reaction of a number of Western colleagues to the strengthening of Russian-Malayan cooperation. We regret that the issues of geopolitical competition do not give them rest. In fact, their claims have nothing to do with concern for the well-being of Mali. On the contrary, they emphasize that they do not care about the opinion of Malayans themselves, and they've never cared. The long-term presence of Western countries in this part of Africa has not produced any tangible results. In this regard, we urge our colleagues on the Council to admit their mistakes and abandon neo-colonial habits. This region does not belong to you.
The criticism from the West comes as Mali has been strengthening its bilateral ties with Russia in a joint fight against terror groups in the Sahel region. Russia's top diplomat recently visited the country to boost cooperation and friendship between the two nations. The U.S. and the U.K. have been particularly outspoken about the direction the African nation is taking. They said the recent expulsion of the chief of the UN mission there, who had slammed the Russian military presence, was a cause of great concern. On the other hand, the long military presence of French troops in the region was always welcomed by Western powers. However, last summer, President Macron decided to end the 9-year military mission there, but it's left thousands of civilians in the Sahel region at risk of terror attacks. France had initially intervened in the country at the request of the local authorities in 2013, but relations between the two nations declined in the wake of Mali's military coup in 2021. For more on this, let's cross live now to Gerald Horne, author and historian, joining us from Houston, Texas. Gerald, it's great to have you on the program today. Now, do you think that the West really still holds neo-colonial views when it comes to African countries, as Russia has claimed?
Oh, obviously, clearly. You have to understand that Mali's problems commenced in 2011 after the United States, France, and the NATO powers overthrew the regime in neighboring Libya, which allowed tons of weapons to leak into the hands of religious zealots who then began an insurgency against the regime. Interestingly enough, France seized on the opportunity to deposit its troops in Mali, but they did not succeed in repelling the insurgency. And of course, France is highly unpopular in that part of Africa because of its neo-colonial pretensions. And so the French were asked to depart, which did not go over very well in Paris. And keep in mind as well that this story connects to your previous story. What I mean is that France, in order to maintain its neo-colonial status in that part of Africa, oftentimes has to rely upon the satellite assets of the United States of America, not to mention the troop transport assets of the United States of America. And reference here the comment by Senator Rubio of Florida, who was quite upset by Mr. Macron going to Beijing and seeking to put some distance between himself and the new Cold War erupting between Beijing and Washington. And so France is really hoisted on its own petard. On the one hand, it wants to maintain a neo-colonial position in Africa. At the same time, it's heavily dependent upon U.S. imperialism, which is seeking to distance itself from in terms of the new Cold War with China.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you have these politicians that say they want to fight back against terrorism, but then you find out that it's only if it's done their way. So why do you think that there is such concern from Western powers over Russia's military presence in the region? I mean, shouldn't the fight against terror be a common goal all around?
Well, it's more than just the fight against so-called terror. Africa is also a storehouse of natural resources and minerals, particularly natural resources necessary for the green economy of the 21st century. Due south in Zimbabwe, you see that the European nations and their ally in Washington are seeking to readjust their hostile position towards that regime because it contains lithium, which is necessary for the green economy. You know that in Mali's neighbor, speaking of Algeria, they have a wealth of natural gas and oil. In light of the Western Europeans seeking to boycott Russian energy, that makes them more heavily dependent upon Algerian industry. And voila, that means also that they're interested in what's happening in Algeria's neighbors, speaking of Mali. So it's not just the so-called fight against terror, it's also a struggle over who is going to be exploiting Africa's resources.
All right, everything is connected at the end of the day. Now, the West has criticized Mali for the expulsion of the UN mission chief from the country. So are you surprised that the authorities in Mali kicked him out? And how effective has the UN mission been in achieving its stated goals?
Well, it's not only Mali that's concerned about the partiality of the United Nations. Many of us on this side of the Atlantic have been highly critical of the United Nations, particularly Secretary General Guterres, who happens to be of Portuguese origins. And he's betraying those origins by seemingly siding with the European Union and with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on many pivotal and crucial issues, for example, Ukraine. So it does not surprise us that the United Nations mission in Mali is accused similarly, that is to say, of leaning in partiality towards France, because I'm afraid to say that that has been its pattern worldwide, and it's not serving as the impartial referee or umpire. It's acting as if it's a player, and that's unacceptable.
Now, speaking of one of the countries that has tried to be a player, that would be France. Now, we know that recently France withdrew its military troops after almost a decade in the region. How symbolic is that move, and what kind of a message does it send to the entire region?
Well, it sends the message to the entire region that you can stand up to France and you do not necessarily have to worry about being overthrown in a military coup, which, by the way, has been the historic pattern. Keep in mind that with regard to Mali in particular, France has an odious reputation. In the 1960s, when that Central West African nation was surging to independence, France played a pivotal role in terms of helping to get rid of its founding father, speaking of Modibo Keita. Recall that in neighboring Burkina Faso in 1987, France's fingerprints were found all over the untimely assassination of its charismatic leader, speaking of Thomas Sankara. And so when France can be asked to evacuate its forces and troops without any sort of apparent retaliation, that suggests that other nations, such as Guinea-Conakry, such as Chad, such as Niger, also can stand up to the neo-colonial emperor in Paris, speaking of Mr. Macron.
Yeah, certainly a lot of moving parts there, but we appreciate you joining us to break it all down. Author and historian Gerald Horne, thanks so much for your time and analysis.
Thank you.